So, tonight we are continuing the study with talking about Peter, who, I have to confess, is probably one of my favorite disciples. Partly because he's one of the ones that's mentioned the most. He's probably the one of them that we know the best. There's certain ones that are considered, of the 12 disciples, there's the inner circle. Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Which is the beginning of the little rhyme of disciples to help you remember the disciples. Did I ever teach you that rhyme? I learned it in Sunday school, and it stuck with me my whole life. Peter, Andrew, James, and John, men he most depended upon. Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew next, and Thomas too. James the less, Judas the greater. Simon the zealot, Judas the traitor. That's the 12 disciples. I tried to think about, after reading the chapter, I wanted to kind of frame it a little bit different about how to talk about Peter. And so I kind of wanted to talk about Peter in in 4 distinct groupings or descriptions. The first is wealth of human qualities. Peter is a mixed bag. When you read the various stories about Peter, there's a lot of dimensions to him. He is emotional. But also scared. He's confident, but also tentative. He's a leader, but he's also a follower. He's a paradox. Some of the examples the book gave show this. One of the clearest examples early on is when he is called to be a disciple. How Jesus comes to him is an interesting way. Jesus comes to meet Peter in a way through Andrew. We get the impression that Andrew is a seeker. Andrew is the type of person who's looking for the Messiah, looking for leadership, looking for a teacher, looking to grow in his faith. He works with his brother, but he's more interested in those things than Peter is. We get the sense that Peter is kind of the blue-collar guy. He doesn't think theoretically about things. He doesn't get lost in thought. What you see is what you get. He works hard. He's honest, almost to a fault. Sometimes he speaks bluntly. And Andrew, you get, is a softer side of Peter, a softer brother. So by way of Andrew, Jesus comes to the village, Bethsaida, where Peter and Andrew, as well as their colleagues, James and John, are fishermen. And Jesus' encounter with Peter is engaging. He doesn't come up to him directly, but he comes up with a crowd of people and asks if he could use the boat that Peter's fishing boat, by which to teach from. That he could get in the boat, go a little bit offshore so that the crowd could see him and he could teach. Peter's done fishing, he's mending nets, it doesn't bother him. And then, after teaching, Jesus asks Peter to go out in the deeper water and cast his nets. And Peter immediately argues. Why? We've been fishing all day. Why would we do that? So he is both agreeable and disagreeable at the same time. And he agrees to go out. So in that one encounter, in that short little synopsis we have of Peter right there, we get that he's not, there's more sides to him, that he's more complicated than we might think at first glance. He is both willing and skeptical at the same time. So he's a wealth of human qualities. We see them clearly. We see his emotions because he wears them on his sleeve. Also, along with being that, he's also, I have to look at my notes here. Similar to this, he is temperamental. When I was in seminary, I had a classmate. He was from Nepal. Born in Nepal, raised in Nepal, came to the States after he became an adult, when he was a young man. He was an adult, but he's still a young adult. I came to learn that part of the reason why he came to the United States, other than that I thought it'd be a good educational experience for him, was that his older brother was in the State Department. Nepal at that time was a monarchy. There was a king. And Prem's brother, my friend's name was Prem Krishna Gangaju. Say that 3 times fast. Okay. Prem's older brother was in the State Department. After Prem graduated from high school, Prem had a habit of standing on the street corners and vigorously calling for the overthrow of the monarchy. So his older brother thought it might be a good idea for his own safety that he not be in Nepal anymore, that he be sent away. I bring him up because he was very Peter in that respect, very much like Peter in that respect, in that Prem wore his emotions on his sleeve. He was almost a victim of his emotions. One moment, he would be telling me that I was his closest friend, I was his most trusted confidant, that I was a king among men, that he admired me so much, he appreciated me, he loved me like a brother, and 15 minutes later, I was an imperialist dog who wanted to ruin the world. By the end of our time in school, Prim had not completely, but somewhat alienated most of his classmates. They just did not have the energy to stick with this roller coaster of emotions. There were basically about 2 of us left that enjoyed spending time with Prim. My friend Chris and myself. Because we didn't take it personal. And we realized that was his nature. He was a talented writer. He had a master's degree in English. We would be walking down the street. He would see a beautiful woman. He would run over, kneel down in front of her, and compose a poem on the spot. He was fun, right? But he was also so frustrating. Peter was someone like that. He was temperamental. We get the impression of that temperament. An example of when we get a part of that temperament is the passage that I preached on this last Sunday, where Jesus is walking with his disciples and he says, "Who do people say that I am?" His disciples say, "Well, some say you're Elijah, some say you're Jeremiah, some say you're John the Baptist, some say you're one of the prophets." And then he says, "But who do you say that I am?" None of the other disciples respond. It's only Peter that responds, and we get a sense that he just blurts it out. "Well, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God." It's what he felt at the time, so he said it. He was impulsive. He is emotional. "I love you. You're the Christ. You're the Messiah. You're it." And then right after that, when Jesus is talking about how he's going to have to die, how he's going to have to be crucified, Peter says, "I don't want to hear it. Don't say that. Don't talk about that." Which is a common emotion. I don't want you to talk about your death. Who wants to hear someone you love talk about how they're going to die? When my dad talks about, "Well, I probably won't be alive a year from now," what's my first reaction? Don't say that. I don't want to hear that. You're going to live. He's emotional. What you see is what you get. When he feels an emotion, he expresses it. It's who he is. There's a wonderful movie by Zeffirelli, I think, Jesus of Nazareth. It's a 3-hour movie. And it's a depiction of Jesus' life. And I love that movie because one of the main reasons why I love the movie is the way it depicts Peter. Because you get the sense of this blustery, emotional, loudmouth guy. Just guy. In fact, when he first meets Peter, when he first meets Jesus, that whole episode about going out and fishing, Andrew comes up to him and says, "I met somebody, you got to meet him." "Oh, you're always chasing after those guys. Why do you do that?" "I don't want to meet him." "That's your thing." And then he meets him, And then Jesus tells them, why don't you take the boat out, throw out the nets again? And Peter looks at Andrew and goes, where do you get these guys? Like, who is this guy? Why should I be listening to him? He doesn't know what he's talking about. That's the emotion you get. That's the temperament you get. And we see it through experience after experience after experience. Peter and the disciples are in a boat. The book makes reference to this. They're in a boat. There's a storm raging. They see Jesus. It was a children's video this last time. They see Jesus walking on the water to them. And Peter says, let me walk on water too. Call me to you. And Jesus says, okay, get out, come. And Peter does for a few steps. Then what happens? Anybody remember? Why? He got scared. He got scared. So he's impulsive enough to jump out of the boat and walk to Jesus, but he also right away feels that emotion of fear and gets overcome by it. He's overcome by faith, and then he's overcome by emotion. You get the impression that there's nothing in between. It's either all the way for or completely off. He's one of the few. He's one of the inner circle. He's one of the few to witness certain things. He sees his mother-in-law get healed. He's one of three that sees the daughter of Jairus getting healed. He's one of three that gets invited up to the mountaintop and sees a transfiguration of Jesus. What's his reaction? Seeing the transfiguration. This is great. We've got to make cathedrals. It's not, wow. He must be the Messiah. What do you want from us, Jesus? No, it's, we got to do this. It's that impulsiveness. And I get the impression that that's part of what Jesus loves about him. But it's also part of what I imagine drove Jesus crazy. So he's temperamental. He's also a leader. We know that early on because Jesus singles him out. Jesus says to him, you are no longer Simon, you are Peter, Petra, which means rock. And upon this rock I will build my church. You're the future of the church. You're the foundation of the church. Jesus recognized the leadership qualities in Peter, right? He's one of the inner circle. He's the one that gets invited to the mountaintop. He's the one that gets to see things that some of the other disciples didn't see. He is the one that expresses what the disciples may be thinking but are afraid to say. He becomes the spokesperson for the disciples. Maybe not so much while Jesus was alive because they were all followers. But when Jesus dies, he's the one that organizes and ends up naming the person to replace Judas in the original 12. And he becomes the first recognized leader of the church. The one who's the leader of the church of the Christians in Rome. So he has leadership quality. He is a leader. But, and this is the last grouping, he is imperfect. He's got severe flaws. As much as he shows bluster and bravado, he is a man wrapped in fear. He's afraid. He's afraid to go out and fish when Jesus first asked him to. He's afraid of the waters that he is walking upon, and he begins to sink. He is afraid of Jesus talking about his death. He is afraid of even saying that he even knows Jesus when Jesus is on trial. He's afraid of being at the cross when Jesus is being crucified. He's afraid of being in public after the resurrection. He is afraid of accepting Paul as a colleague. He's afraid. He's not perfect. Oh, he wants Jesus to just talk about happy things, not about death. He wants cathedrals made on a mountain, not so much to glorify Jesus, be a living example that he was a part of this mysterious, magical, miraculous event. He doesn't want to reach out to the Gentiles. He wants to keep it at home. He's not perfect. He's a fallible, simple man. So what do we learn from all this? The book, what I value about the message that comes out through all the lessons in this book, is it's all about being close. What is faith? Faith is making the choice of being close to God. Doing what we can to draw close to God in whatever way we can. what is remarkable about each of these people that we're looking at, whether it be Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, now Peter, is that each of them had at different times in their relationship with Jesus had a choice of either drawing closer to Jesus or having their focus on Jesus, or focusing on themselves and as a result drawing away. Each time Peter draws away from Jesus in those stories is when he makes the choice of focusing more on his needs than what Jesus is doing or what Jesus is saying. When he starts focusing on his own fear, when he starts focusing on his own needs, when he starts focusing on his own desires, when they come to the forefront, Jesus gets pushed away. But when he, whether by emotions or faith or being touched by what Jesus is saying and doing, puts his emotion and his energy towards Jesus, that's when he starts seeing things, getting it. Like we talked about last week with Mary Magdalene. When he gets it. When he gets it is when he sees the larger picture, when he sees what's the truth of what's going on, what Jesus is teaching, what Jesus is saying. When he gets it is when he's focused on it. When he's focused on it is when he gets it. Right? He gets it on that boat in the middle of the sea when he's focusing on Jesus and the fact that he wants to be near him, when he wants to get close. But when he's distracted and he's looking at the waters and he starts thinking, I'm not that good a swimmer, I may not be that good a swimmer, these waves are really big, then all of a sudden his focus is gone from Jesus, and no longer is his faith keeping him on top of the water, but he starts sinking. When he's focusing on his own safety and what might happen to him, he denies he even knows Jesus. Never mind the fact that before, when Jesus was being arrested in the garden, Peter is ready to take arms against the very people who are arresting him. We're all capable of this, right? We all have Peter in us in some degree or another. What the book is telling us is that Peter has a lot to teach us about our own characters and what it means to be faithful. When we put our focus on what Jesus is saying and doing, on the gospel of Jesus, on the ministry of Jesus, and when we focus on that, then we draw closer to Jesus and we find ourselves in relationship to Jesus, and those things that scare us become less scary. But when we put our focus on ourselves and Jesus takes the back seat, then those things take the front seat. And they're what controls our choices. It's simple, but but it's not easy. So that's how I framed this particular chapter. Questions? Complaints? Arguments? Surely, Diane, you got some argument.
I like everything you said, but I'm curious about one thing.
Okay.
I see nothing in the Bible that tells me Peter ever went to Rome, and you said he became the leader of the church.
It's extra canonical stuff. There's a book called The Acts of Peter, and we find a lot of those type of things. That's where we find the origin of the belief that Peter was crucified upside down. There's a legend that Peter was crucified upside down.
But if it's not canonical, how do we know we can trust it?
You can trust it.
My problem is he was a simple fisherman
Right.
in Galilee who would have no connection with Rome. I mean, Paul went to Rome. He was a Roman.
Except for in the Acts of the Apostles, we see a lot of action in Rome. Right?
But he's a Roman citizen.
But Peter's there too.
But how do you know that?
Because there's instances of Peter speaking in Rome, being in Rome.
Maybe in that other book you're talking about.
In the Acts of the Apostles too.
Really? I don't recall that. I've read it, but I didn't know that.
When Peter gets the vision of the sheet with all the unclean animals, he's in Rome. Oh, Jerusalem. I'm sorry, not Rome. I've been misspeaking the whole time. Jerusalem.
Yeah, that I believe.
Jerusalem. I'm sorry. Sorry. That was my mistake. I'm sorry, Dayton. That was what confused you. Is I was speaking about, I was saying Rome when I meant Jerusalem.
Yeah, he was obviously the leader of the church in Jerusalem. That's why.
Right, yeah. But they also, church tradition does have that he was also connected with Rome, because the Roman Catholic Church derives its apostolic succession from Peter. They claim. So church tradition, and we as Protestants come from that tradition. We may argue with certain points, but the tradition throughout the church history was that the first leader of the church was Peter.
There's no question in my mind that is true. My question is, did he ever leave Jerusalem to go to Rome?
We don't know of any specific examples necessarily, but we can certainly imagine that given the power, the place that Rome played in the world at that time and the need to establish itself, that if you're going to be a leader of the church, you're going to probably travel to Rome at some point. It makes sense. Yeah. So I'm going to say, you might be right. He never have, but I kind of think he probably did.
Okay, this doesn't have anything to do with Peter, but we were talking about this when the Bible was written or put together. Was this a group of people that sat down and did it? Is that what you're saying? And where did they get their information? Are they finding schools?
Okay, there's a whole another class on that. Basically, you have two different things you're talking about about the Bible coming together. you're talking about the coming together of what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. And then you have the coming together of the New Testament. And they had different sources. The Old Testament, had a number of sources. The early part of the Old Testament, where we get most of the story, the Pentateuch. Okay, see ya. You have what is called the Old Epic Narrative. And this is the history that is essentially told in the Torah or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. Right? There is to believe to be 4 sources to that material that you find in, not just in the first 5 books of the Bible, but through Ezra and Nehemiah as well, and Chronicles. Sources are represented by 4 letters. The Yahwist, the Elohist, the Deuteronomist, and the priestly sources. These 2 tell the story of Genesis through Joshua and the Judges. Joshua, Judges. The reason why they believe that this is 2 of that narrative is because you have different writings within the 2. There was a controversial book back when I was in seminary, actually. It's put out by Harold Bloom, who is a scholar of literature at Yale. He had the Old Testament committed to memory. He was brilliant. Good friend of mine, she was a TA for him. She said at one time he was clocked at reading 400 pages in an hour. He had nearly photographic memory. He had all of the Old Testament, all of Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained committed to memory. He wrote a book called the Book of J. What was controversial about that book is he made the argument that the author of that particular narrative within the Bible was a woman. Never, ever thought of before by any scholar before him. Made national news because it was so controversial. I remember watching him being interviewed on the Today Show. There was 2, where they think these 2 sources came from is, a reason why there's these 2 sources is because there's 2 kingdoms. Israel was divided into the 2 kingdoms, and they each had their own story to tell. The northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And they both told the same story essentially, but they had little different shades of difference. A little different emphasis. The Deuteronomistic source was basically Deuteronomy. But the reason why it's considered a source is because it was believed to be the way we understood the narrative past Deuteronomy, the story of Israel after, through the time of the judges, through the kingdom, 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. That if you look at Deuteronomy, you read your Deuteronomy and what is expressed there, and you use that as a lens, you can use that as a lens by which to understand that particular history, right? The other source is the priestly source. And they believe that to be the most clear in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, because 1st and 2nd Chronicles also tell the same story that you find in the other history, but they seem a lot more concerned with the practices of the temple. What does all this mean? It means that there were different groups within the church after the time of Josiah that believed it was important to write down these stories by which they told each other and they told their history. But they had different ways of interpreting it. Some wanted to interpret it in the words of the priest. Some wanted to interpret it in the ways of Moses' sermons in Deuteronomy. Some of them wanted to interpret it in terms of these stories that they grew up learning. So instead, and at different times, and that this canon, this Old Testament canon, came together over a period of hundreds of years, that over time different parties had control over what story was more important, so they got mixed together. Does that all make sense?
But were these things written down or just by word of mouth? How?
They began as word of mouth. But after Josiah, the only thing that was written down before Josiah was the scrolls that he found. Josiah was the king of Israel. And he believed that he wanted to reform Israel. So he started with that the temple needed to be cleaned. When they cleaned the temple, they found the scrolls of Moses. And he says, okay, this is by which we're going to reform. These scrolls are going to be by the which we're going to reform our nation and we're going to get back to God. Once that started, then other groups started saying, hey, we have something to say too, and they started writing things down. Okay? Then they started discovering other writings that had also been written down too. You know what the oldest book in the Bible is? Job.
That was the first one written.
First one written. But not all of Job. Just the poetic part. The part at the beginning and the end that is narrative, that says why Job was suffering, that was added later to interpret why Job was saying all these things and God was responding. Okay. To make sense of it.
But even though they weren't written down until that time, these things could be retold from generation without any significant change. I've read like the old epics, like the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Absolutely.
People put them, they just memorized them.
Because they had to, because they didn't know how to write.
So they go,
Or they didn't have paper to write on.
they go back much further than
Right.
the actual written form.
Absolutely. So that's what we have to deal with the Bible, is that the stories predate the writing of the Bible by hundreds and hundreds of years. Centuries.
But it makes sense, like Dayton said, they had developed good
Right.
ways of memorization.
Yeah, because they were telling them all the time, because they knew it was important to keep these stories alive. Because they knew if they didn't keep the stories alive, then they would cease to exist as a people. like, well, how many mothers don't write their recipes down? They just, if they want to pass them on, they just tell them. They just show their daughters. Or in some cases sons, but most often daughters, right? But I don't want to write it down. I don't know how to measure it out. You just take a pinch, right? You just make it taste right. Okay? So this oral tradition or telling stories, passing down stories, it's a part of who we are as humans, right? So what happens with the Old Testament once Israel gets taken over first by the Hellenists and then by Rome, first the Greek influence and then the Roman influence, is that all these scrolls and all these stories and all these testimonies, the story of Israel, they want to collect it together in one document, right? So they decided to write it in the most common language at the time, which is Greek. So they write the Septuagint. Yeah. Right. Right. But they wanted to collect it all together because some of it was in Aramaic and some of it was in Hebrew. And a lot of the Christians or Israelites were now Hellenized, and some of them were born Jewish who didn't even know Aramaic anymore. All they knew was Greek because that's what they grew up with. So the Septuagint is written. That becomes a foundation for the translation we have of the Old Testament. The Septuagint brings it all together. And there's a legend of the Septuagint, and I believe it's a legend because I don't think it's true. It's just one of those legends to make it seem true. But the legend is that in order to make it authentic and make sure that it was truly inspired by God, they collected 70 Greek scholars, and they each had to translate those documents and separately. And when they came together, they were all word for word the same. That is impossible. Can't even agree, let alone 70.
When you translate, you're not going word for word, you're recreating.
Right, because there are certain words that just don't translate perfectly.
Word for word, it won't make any sense.
Right.
Everything will be all out of
Yeah, because the sentence structure and everything is different. So, but that's the legend. That it was so, that it is because God was controlling all of them and inspiring all of them, it was word for word the same. Whether you believe the legend or not, the Septuagint is a crucial document because it becomes the basis of our modern day translation, the first basis of our modern day translation of the Old Testament.
But then the later translations go back and
Then later on, as scholarship improves and everything, then they decided, no, let's go back to the original Aramaic. Let's go back to Koine well, let's go back to Hebrew, which is a dead language. I mean, they speak Hebrew, but it's a different kind of Hebrew than biblical Hebrew. Biblical Hebrew is a dead language. And Aramaic, and interpret it that way, translate it that way. But they're still comparing it against the Septuagint. So that's the story of the Old Testament. The New Testament believes that there is what was called the Q source. Please don't confuse it with QAnon. The Q source, well, the reason why it was called Q source is because it was a question. They are not sure how these stories came about, who started them. All they know is that they were in the ether, right? That they were stories about Jesus that were being told. Then you had the letters, the next, and they were existing. They weren't being written down. They weren't written down. The Q source weren't written down. They were just stories that were being told, right? The first part of the New Testament that is written down is what? Anybody's guess?
The letters of Paul.
Letters of Paul. When it comes to the Gospels, the order is believed to be Mark, then Matthew, then Luke, then John. And when we say Luke, we include with it Acts. Because most scholars consider Luke, Acts, to be a 2-volume set. That was the same author. Because this scholarship of how they came together was later. It was the later scholars that came up with what they justified it. But first, and who knows? It's just how they fell together.
You know why it's called Q? Q stands for the German word Quelle,
Ah,
which means source.
okay.
That's all it is. It could be called S in
Yeah,
English,
yeah.
but Q. But they get the
How do we know this is all inspired by God? By faith. Essentially, that's it. By faith. Because there are people who do not believe. There are New Testament scholars that have spent their whole life studying the New Testament and teaching on the New Testament that don't necessarily believe that they were inspired by God. So why are their opinions important? Because they spent their whole life studying it, right? And because they know a lot about it. So the context, the style of writing, the dating of it, those are all academic questions. The authority that it has in our faith is a faith question. Right.
I've read a number of books on this topic, but I don't begin to claim I know more than you. I know you know way, way more than I do, and I don't want to give that impression.
No,
I've only read a few books you've studied.
believe me, I'm not trying to stand up here like an expert. I'm just sharing what I've learned is all and there are people that, there are professors and there are classmates of mine, including my friend John, who stood up with me at my wedding who would probably be standing here and say, you know, Blair, you're not getting it quite right there.
I do have one question that's totally irrelevant to
Okay.
all of this. How did your friend from Nepal become a Christian?
He described himself this way: Hindu by birth, pagan by temperament, Christian by accident. I don't know. He never really talked about it. All I know is that sometimes when he talked about Jesus, he would come to tears. But he was a mixed bag. He also told me a story. And again, you can believe it or not, but he believed it absolutely. He said that when he was born, his mother died in childbirth, when giving birth to him. And that the Hindu tradition is that when a male son is born, the father is to go up into the mountains and give a sacrifice to the monkey god for the health and the happiness of the male child. But that Prem's father was so devastated by the death of Prem's mother that he forgot to do so. Prem said he did not speak. Prem did not speak for the first 5 years of his life. Did not say a single word. They tried to, he just never spoke. When he was 5 years old, on his 5th birthday, his father woke up that morning and remembered that he remembered the birth, and he remembered that he had never offered the sacrifice. So he went up to the mountain and offered the sacrifice. They had dinner that day, and Prem began to speak in full sentences. Believe the story or not, Prem believed the story absolutely. I wasn't going to argue with him. But it's an interesting story, huh?